chapter number 8. Ecclesiastes chapter number 8. And originally, we're going to be in chapter 9. I've been in so many chapters in Ecclesiastes this week that I'm starting to lose it. But we'll be in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, and my original intent was to just cover chapter 9 this morning. But then when I began to consider Solomon's broader thought, I realized we probably need to cover chapter 9, chapter 10, and the first 6 verses of chapter 11. And so, don't worry, if we just read those 2.5 chapters or so, we would be ready to dismiss after reading them. So we're not going to get an opportunity to read every single verse and perhaps not even cover every verse. But I think that we'll be able to pick up Solomon's big idea as we move quickly, hopefully, through chapters 9, 10, going into verse 6 of chapter 11. And so as we've seen in the first 6 chapters, Solomon has expressed his observations of life. He's noted the disparities. He's noted the inconsistencies. He's noted that the world is fallen and that people are broken and that the way the world is now is not the way that God originally intended the world to be. He has viewed life from the perspective of its fallenness. And viewing life from the perspective of its fallenness, Solomon has attempted to recreate that Garden of Eden experience, and he's found out that regardless of what avenue he pursues, that regardless of what things he tries, regardless of the environments that he attempts to construct, he realizes that he's never going to be able to recapture that perfect world. He realizes that attempting to recapture a perfect world is aiming at a moving target. It's inaccessible, and ultimately, in the end, it's impossible and futile and really a waste of his time. It's meaningless. All is vanity. It's empty. And so that's the first 6 chapters. But when we get to chapter 7, Solomon pivots. Solomon, of course, he's made his observations, and now he begins to express to us his conclusions. His first conclusion from chapter 6, verse 10 through chapter 8 and verse 17 is that man's wisdom is limited. Yes, God gives wisdom to help us to stay on the right path. Wisdom alerts us to when we're going off the path that God has intended for us. But human wisdom that is derived from connecting various philosophies of man from under the sun and connecting various traditions to them and applying them in various ways with different meanings, he realizes that man's wisdom, man's philosophy as it is under the sun, is limited. On our own, our wisdom cannot fully understand or comprehend God's ways. And so Solomon in chapters 6, 7, and 8, he encourages us to learn and to follow not man's principles for living, but God's principles for living. And now, as we get to chapter 9, and of course we'll go through chapter 11 and verse 6 this morning, he arrives at a second conclusion regarding his observations of life under the sun. And this is where we'll spend the bulk of our talk this morning. He says that man's knowledge is limited. Man's knowledge is finite. Complete knowledge of the courses of nature lies beyond human grasp. And for us, this requires that we have to be okay with a certain amount of ignorance regarding how God governs our world and how He cares for us. Now, that's something that is hard for us. That's something that is challenging. In the information age that we live in, with information at our fingertips, literally, none of us like to assume that we're going to go through life without the ability of knowing something. But Solomon says that when it comes to understanding and comprehending God, His ways, His character, His attributes, His wisdom, our knowledge is limited. It is finite. Now, why does Solomon say that? What kind of knowledge is Solomon referring to? Well, he's making a distinction, and he'll make a distinction here in these 2 or so chapters, between our wisdom, or our knowledge, and God's knowledge. Now, when Solomon refers to God's knowledge, he's not referring to human intuition. So that would be like when someone demonstrates just the uncanny sensitivity to events that are going on around them, or they're able to discern through a conversation the character of someone that they're speaking to. All right, that is human knowledge. And of course, God possesses that knowledge, but that's not the knowledge that Solomon is referring to. But Solomon, when it comes to knowledge, he's also not referring to prediction. Business forecasting, strategic analysis, weather forecasting. These predictions stem from using equipment and analyzing data that is readily available. So when Solomon refers to knowledge here in this chapter, he's not referring to knowledge that we can comprehend, that we can process, that we can analyze, that we can use to make predictions or forecasts based upon. But when Solomon speaks of knowledge, and when he says that our knowledge is limited or finite, he is referring to God's omniscience. In comparison to God's omniscience, and specifically God's foreknowledge, our knowledge is very limited. And so Solomon, when he speaks of God's knowledge, and he speaks of knowledge in this chapter, he is referring to God's omniscience. God's omniscience is His ability to know the details of everything that happens. God knows everything, and He knows everything before everything happens. God, He knows what has happened, He knows what is happening, and He knows what will happen. And His foreknowledge plays a significant role in that. Now, what role does His foreknowledge play in His ability to know what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen? Well, it's God's foreknowledge that sets everything in play. God, from His position of sovereignty, permits and appoints every event, every circumstance, every situation into our life. And so from that standpoint alone, God knows far more than we can ever know. And so Solomon, in these 2 chapters, he admits, based upon his observations, that in comparison to God's infinite knowledge, our knowledge is rather limited. And so Solomon here in these chapters, he presents man's knowledge as limited in the light of God's omniscience. And so in these 2 or so chapters, Solomon is going to draw our attention to the things that we do not and cannot know because we are not omniscient. He shows us that other than the fact that we all will die, the rest of our lives are shrouded with uncertainty. And so this morning, Solomon, we'll take a look at how Solomon presents this to us. He presents to us his findings on how our knowledge, is limited. And so we'll look at it first from the perspective that this is a tension or a reality that we must face. We must be okay with the fact that God has not designed or intended for us to know everything. And so interpreted from the perspective of life under the sun, Solomon states that life is unknowable. There is no knowledge that can bring full certainty in life. In verse number 1, Solomon says this, "For I considered all this in my heart, so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise in their works are in the hand of God. People neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them." And so Solomon here in this verse, he reminds us that all of our lives are in God's hands. Our actions are under His control. He says here that specifically, even the wise and the righteous, he says they can't be certain about the outcome of their lives. Specifically, whether love or hate awaits them. Now, there's some question as to love and hate and to whom it is referring to. Is this referring to God's love and hate, or is this referring to the love and hate of mankind? Verse 6 seems to indicate that this is referring to love and hate of mankind. So if that's the case, then if these terms, love and hate, designate the actions of other people toward us, then we can't really know what they truly think about us. And perhaps even because life is so unpredictable, he's saying we can't even truly know how we feel about them. And so if love and hate are unpredictable, then it follows that all of life is equally unpredictable. In life, we can't fully interpret what God is doing. Solomon says if we can't even determine whether love or hatred is being showed toward us, or whether we're showing love or hate towards someone else. If that's the case, if we can't even understand those foundational emotions, then it serves to follow that the rest of life is equally as unpredictable. And again, this is Solomon's take as he views life from the perspective of under the sun. We can't interpret everything God is doing. Life is unpredictable. But Solomon also, he says in verse number 2, all things come alike to all. He says, there is one event to the righteous and to the wicked, to the good and to the clean and to the unclean, to him that sacrifices and to him that sacrifices not. As it is the good, so is the sinner. And he that sweareth, as he that feareth an oath. Solomon, he continues to address this tension, and he addresses the commonness of destiny. Now, ultimately, death is in view here. But this opening statement here doesn't refer exclusively to death. He says all things come alike to all. But what Solomon is saying, before he says that death comes to everybody, he's saying simply that anything can happen to anyone. It's unpredictable. You could be good and something evil. You could be righteous and something evil will happen to you. You could be wicked and something good will happen to you. You could do this expecting this outcome, and that's not the outcome you're going to have. Life is unpredictable. Life is no respecter of persons. Now, from our perspective, we view tragedy and mishap and mistakes as accidents. But from God's perspective, those are His appointed trials in our lives. And so, while we interpret perhaps tragedy, mishaps, and accidents as chance or fate from our perspective under the sun, we can't fully know the reason why God allows those things into our lives, because He's omniscient and He's sovereign. And so Solomon, there's tension that we must face in lives and things that we must come to grips with. And the first here is that in life, we can't interpret everything God is doing, because from our perspective, it doesn't seem like there's any rhyme or reason to any of it. Now, secondly, this tension shows us that we cannot predict or avoid death. Solomon reminds us that the timing of our death cannot be known. So Solomon, he begins in verse 2, he says, all things come alike to all. But then in verse 3, he narrows this down. He says, this is an evil and all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. So Solomon says the one thing that happens to all, he now narrows it down to death. At the end of the day, that's the only thing that we can be certain of, is that we will die. But we don't know how we're going to die. We don't know when we're going to die. We don't know what the circumstances surrounding our death are going to be. Solomon in verse 4, he says, but for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. A living dog is better than a dead lion. So, Solomon here, he states that it's better to be a living dog than a dead lion. We may not be much in life, he says, but at least we have life. So we should make the most of it while we can, because according to verses 11 and 12, you never know when your life is going to be taken from you. It'll come as a surprise. And so Solomon begins to describe the things that we cannot know, and we cannot predict our deaths or avoid or predict its timing. But thirdly, Solomon also refers to the fact of another thing that we can't know. Life's outcomes. We can't know what the results are going to be of choices that we make or things that we do. Things that would make sense and be logical and be rational are not really logical or rational. You would expect 1 + 1 to equal 2, but Solomon says in life that's not the case. 1 + 1 can equal 3. 1 + 1 can equal 1. 1 + 1 could equal 4. Life's outcomes can't be predicted. In verse number 13, Solomon, he says, this wisdom also I have seen under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king against it besieged it and built great snares around it. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that same poor man. Then said I, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. So Solomon, he gives us a parable of a poor old man who happened to possess great wisdom. He describes that there was a tyrannical king that was going to come and overtake and overthrow and capture the people and everything in this small city. But by this poor old man's wisdom, he was able to devise a plan whereby the city could be saved from this overpowering tyrannical king. Now you would expect from that story that this poor old wise man, perhaps feeble, perhaps unassuming, you would expect the fact that his wisdom, that the plan that he devised to save their city worked, you would expect him to be elevated and lifted up on a pedestal. You would expect a statue perhaps to be made of him. You would perhaps expect a building to be named after him. You would expect this man to be honored in some great way. But Solomon says, in life, what seems logical, what seems like the right thing, is not logical. It's not the right thing. Instead, people despise this poor old wise man. They hated him, and they hated his wisdom. And that doesn't make sense. And that's the way life works, from Solomon's perspective under the sun. The things that you think would produce these outcomes or result in this type of recognition do not. And so we cannot predict life's outcomes. Other examples we won't take time to go through, but if we read down through chapter 10, verse 15, Solomon gives other examples that demonstrate that the outcomes in life can't be predicted. In chapter 9, verse 11, he says that the fastest runner doesn't always win the race. He also says in that verse that the strongest army doesn't always win the battle. He also says that the wise don't always have food or prosperity. He says that the intelligent and the skillful are not always rewarded. He says in verse 12 that people are caught suddenly by unexpected events, like fish in a net or birds in a snare. He also speaks in chapter 10, verse number 1, that even a small mistake can outweigh much wisdom, like dead flies ruining perfume. He says in verses 5 through 7 and 16 and 17 that foolish rulers can rise to power, while capable people are overlooked. In verse 14 of chapter 10, he says that no one can tell what will happen next or what will come after them. In chapter 11 and in verse 2, he says that you cannot know what disaster may come upon the land. In verse 5, he says you can't understand all the works of God. In verse 6, you can't know which of your efforts will prosper. Because a man cannot tell that which shall be, we cannot expect life to follow our script. We can't expect life to result in outcomes that are predictable. And so again, Solomon, under the sun, he tells us the things that we cannot know. We cannot know or predict life's outcomes, even when it seems obvious. But also, fourthly, Solomon tells us, and this is the tension and the reality that we live under, he says that we cannot tell what evil or good may come. So not only can we not predict what outcomes may result from certain choices or decisions or appointments or things that we do, he says that we can't even determine if those will result in good or evil. We can't even begin to grasp our minds or wrap our minds around potential outcomes. In chapter 10, verse 16, through chapter 11 and verse 2, Solomon refers to bad leadership and hard times and unexpected troubles. And so because they come, we must be prepared. Solomon also says that conversely, that we don't know what of our efforts will prosper. We don't know what seeds that we sow will grow. We don't know even what opportunities that we find ourselves involved in. We don't know how they'll bear fruit. So Solomon says, sow anyway. Solomon says, act anyway. Live by faith anyway. Human life cannot be governed by certainty, control, or full understanding. And this tension, the things that we cannot know in life, the uncertainty of life, they teach us that control is just an illusion. And so that's the bad news. Solomon in these 2 or so chapters expresses the tension that we face because life is unknowable. And to make it worse, the only thing in life that is knowable is that we will one day die. But Solomon doesn't leave us there. Also in these 2 chapters, he gives to us instruction. He instructs us how to live in the uncertainty. Many people, they look at the uncertainty of life and they say, okay, what's the use? Okay, there's no purpose in life. There's no reason for living. So I'm just going to throw all caution to the wind and I'm going to live for myself. Solomon describes this attitude towards life in chapter 9 and in verse number sorry, I'm still getting used to using a different translation. I'm lost. He says in verse 3, this is an evil that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the Son of Men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. So they adopt this perspective that, hey, if we're going to die anyways, we might as well eat, drink, and be merry, because you never know when death is going to come. But Solomon, in these passages, he warns against that. He instructs us to live the opposite. He instructs us to live not for ourselves, because death may come at any moment, but he instructs us not to waste our lives. He instructs us to live faithfully for God while we can. I don't know how many of you caught the interview with Ben Sass this week, but recently he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And he discussed on a podcast regrets that he had in life, or if there's anything that he would do differently, now knowing that he probably has not too long to live. And he shared in that podcast, in that interview, how that his perspective on things in life changed, and how he would go back and redo certain things in his life in his 20s and his 30s. And he mentioned how that he would prioritize the Lord's day further and made sure that he didn't skip out on that by working through that day, but rather spend an entire day devoted to the things of the Lord and to take a break from his work and from his labors and from his efforts. And when we are confronted with the reality of death and that our deaths are impending, it changes our outlook, doesn't it? It'll change the way that we view things. It'll change the way that we do things. It'll change the things that we prioritize in life. Now, in reality, all of us are in the same boat. We're all individuals with an expiration date, and we don't know when that expiration date is. And so because life is unknowable and we can't predict things, we shouldn't just waste our lives and say, well, since I can't know this or know that, or since there's no use in this because I'm going to die anyways, I'm just going to live for myself and waste my life. Solomon instructs us not to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die, but he instructs us to eat, drink, and be merry because this is God's will for your life. And we'll see how the gospel transforms that thinking in our minds here in just a minute. But Solomon, he encourages us that even though death is impending and we have expiration dates, he encourages us to live faithfully even in the unknown. We don't have to let what we don't know stop us from living for God, stop us from doing the things that God would want us to do while we can. And so Solomon, he gives us 3 suggestions how we can live life purposefully and intentionally and not just kind of float through life. He says in verses 7 through 9 of chapter 9, receive life gratefully as God's present. Receiving life gratefully as God's present means God's gifts allow us to rejoice in his provision. Here Solomon mentions the gifts of food and drink and celebrations and family, and we should accept them as the portion that God has given to us. Solomon encourages us to intentionally embrace these gifts because God has given us these gifts to sustain us in the midst of difficult life. But also when we receive these gifts gratefully, we're also recognizing God's supremacy in our limitations. We're recognizing that he is the one who is the giver, and these are not gifts or things that we have achieved ourselves. And so Solomon gives us instructions on how to live in the midst of life's uncertainties. He says, first of all, receive life gratefully as God's present. But secondly, he tells us in verse number 10 to act diligently in the time that we have. In verse number 10, Solomon says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave wherever you're going. Solomon encourages to work diligently because none of us know how much time we have left to do so. None of us know when the opportunities for work, the opportunities for service are going to run out. We may not know when we will die, but we do know that we will. And so whatever work God has assigned for us to do in this brief life, it should be done intentionally and with a sense of urgency. It doesn't mean to burn out, but it just means to live and to work and to serve with a purpose and fully embrace God's purpose for you in that regard. And so Solomon encourages us to act diligently in the time that we have. And then Solomon, thirdly, he encourages us to live wisely, even without guaranteed outcomes. We already talked about the poor wise man whose wisdom was despised, even though he devised a plan to save his city from a tyrannical ruler. But we know that yet, rather than being rewarded and celebrated, he was despised and forgotten. Now, if you're that poor wise man, how would you feel? Here I am. I'm the one that saved the city. I'm the one that ridded us of that tyrannical king. I'm the one who devised a plan. I'm the one who used my ingenuity. I'm the one that put the whole plan in order and together, and the city is saved because of me. But yet, no one seems to acknowledge you. And worse, not only does no one seem to acknowledge you, but people actually despise you. They actually hate you. They actually look down upon you. Now, from this perspective, what this poor old wise man did was an act of selflessness. Perhaps this poor old wise man, he devised this plan without even expecting anything in return. But regardless, the poor wise man's anonymity after delivering the city reveals a hard truth. And that means that to live wisely without guaranteed outcomes, or to act selflessly, it means, in his case, it means to act without expectations that others will acknowledge or remember your role. And this can be troubling if we find our identity is wrapped up in outcomes. If we find our identity is wrapped up in what we do, what we say, how people perceive us, how people recognize us. This can be devastating if our identification and our sense of self-worth is wrapped in expecting certain outcomes from the things that we do, in adoration from certain people. But this poor old wise man, he gives us an example that selflessness should be rooted, and our identity should be rooted in the example of Christ. When our identity is wrapped up in Christ, it doesn't matter what people say about us. It doesn't matter what people do to us. It doesn't matter what people think about us. It doesn't matter what recognition we receive. Because when our identity is wrapped up in Christ, we realize that if Christ was despised and rejected of men, why should we expect anything different? And so we're to live wisely even without the guaranteed outcomes of being recognized or praised. And so Solomon, he tells us to live faithfully, even in the things that we don't know. And how does this perspective sustain us? Well, it sustains us because we see life. We view life not from under the sun, but from above the sun. We see life in light of God's greater redemptive plan. We've already touched on this, and we'll just move real quickly here because my time is done. But in the light of the uncertainties of life, Solomon, as he suggests, many people will eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow they will die. But Solomon flips that thinking around. He reverses it. And he says, eat, drink, and be merry because God now accepts thy works. Those who fear God, they do not cling to today because they are anxious that death may come tomorrow, but rather they are free to enjoy today because they no longer live in the fear of death. Death and hell and the fear of the unknown should not terrorize the believer because the Lord Jesus Christ has won victory over sin and death. And so we see here that the perspective that changes our attitude towards the unknowable things of life for the believer living on the other side of the cross is rooted in God's love, because God's love is settled in Christ. We see also that death is certain, but not final for the believer, and that God will bring perfect justice in his time. And so here's the call for us this morning. In the uncertainty of life, we must, while we can, live gratefully. We must love deeply. We must serve diligently. We must walk humbly with God. And we must redeem the time that he has given. None of us really know what lies ahead, but we know the one who holds our lives. So we live wisely, we live faithfully, we live purposefully before God while we can. Well, let's go ahead and we'll close this morning with